I'm not a sexual predator. I'm an offender. It's the difference between a murderer and someone who steals a bagel. Jeffrey Epstein, New York Post, 2011. The words linger, unsettling. They are not just a defense. They are a distortion, a disavowal of responsibility for decades of systematic abuse. The chilling self-assurance in Epstein's voice echoes even after his death, as the darkness surrounding his name continues to stretch across the corridors of power. This is the story of how one man, cloaked in influence, manipulated an entire system, how the rich and powerful turned a blind eye, and how survivors, silenced for years, finally shattered that silence. In the end, Epstein's conviction was never realized. He was never held to answer for the true extent of his crimes, but the fallout of his actions has not and will not fade. New York, 2002. The world knows Jeffrey Epstein as a financier, a man with connections that spanned the globe. He mingled with politicians, academics, celebrities. He held court at the exclusive Mar-a-Lago Club, a place where power was both coveted and wielded. In the public eye, he was a man of mystery, enigmatic, untouchable, wealthy beyond measure. His jet, nicknamed the Lolita Express, was as much a symbol of his reach as his private island, Little St. James. But it was more than just wealth that allowed Epstein to thrive in the upper echelons of society. It was his ability to conceal the darkest parts of himself under a carefully crafted veneer of charm and allure. The world looked at him as a financier, a philanthropist, a man of influence. But it would soon become apparent that these were mere masks, and they would eventually slip, exposing something much darker beneath. Epstein's empire was built on manipulation, not just of the market, but of people. Young women, some of them still children. He trafficked in both power and flesh. The men and women who called themselves his friends or associates were complicit in their ignorance, or perhaps in their silence. They failed to ask the right questions, choosing instead to indulge in the illusion that Epstein's success was a product of sheer genius rather than exploitation. But within the high walls of his mansions, his private island, and on his private plane, Epstein's true self was lurking. Behind the smiles and grand gestures, there was something much more sinister, a business built on the lives of vulnerable young girls. In 2005, a single phone call started the unraveling of Epstein's world. A mother in Palm Beach, Florida, called the police after discovering that her 14-year-old daughter had been lured into Epstein's home. The girl, who had been paid to massage him, soon found herself part of a pattern that stretched across Epstein's many residences and that implicated dozens of underage girls, some as young as 14. The investigation that followed would uncover the depths of Epstein's manipulations, but at the time, few understood how far this would reach. Epstein's first arrest came in 2006, but what followed was a deeply troubling pattern. Despite mounting evidence, despite the testimonies of dozens of women and young girls, Epstein's connections to powerful figures in law enforcement, politics, and finance provided him with a degree of protection that allowed him to evade the justice system. Court records reveal that investigators were stonewalled. In an affidavit filed during the early stages of the investigation, Palm Beach Police Chief Michael Reiter made it clear that Epstein had been actively obstructing the inquiry. This was not a he said, she said situation. This was 50-something she's and one he, and they she's all basically told the same story. The voices of the victims were being drowned out by the tide of Epstein's influence, and as the case moved through the legal system, it was clear that the full scope of Epstein's actions would never come to light. Not yet, not fully. In 2008, Epstein's case took a stunning turn. Federal prosecutors, including Alexander Acosta, brokered a deal that would become infamous. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Epstein avoided federal charges in favor of a state plea deal that saw him serve just 13 months in a private wing of a Florida jail. He was given work release privileges, an absurdly lenient sentence that allowed him to leave the jail during the day and return to his lavish lifestyle each evening. A deal that protected Epstein at the expense of the victims. To the public, the deal seemed incomprehensible, and yet it went largely unnoticed. The women who had been preyed upon, were left with nothing but the haunting knowledge that their abuser would likely never face full accountability. Maxwell, Epstein's longtime confidant, continued to work behind the scenes. She was said to have introduced many of the women to Epstein, acted as a recruiter, and even participated in some of the abusive acts herself. And while Epstein was enjoying his work release privileges, Maxwell's network continued to operate in the shadows, unseen by the public eye, but deeply embedded in the global elite. The silence around Epstein's crimes was bought and paid for. And it wasn't until 2018, when a new investigation was launched by the Miami Herald, that the dam of silence began to crack. Survivors began to tell their stories, and the world was forced to reckon with what Epstein had done. By 2018, investigative journalist Julie Brown had uncovered a trove of information about Epstein, including interviews with women who had been sexually trafficked by him and others who had been complicit in the operation. Brown's reporting, first published by the Miami Herald, served as a turning point. The article led to renewed pressure on the justice system to reopen Epstein's case. The media frenzy intensified, with survivors coming forward, speaking about their experiences and the systemic failures that allowed Epstein to operate freely for so long. As the public became aware of the scale of Epstein's crimes, the door to justice cracked open. However, the question remained: why had the authorities failed for so long to hold Epstein accountable? How had such a high-profile figure been able to manipulate the legal system? And how many more victims were there still? The walls of silence that Epstein had constructed around him were beginning to crumble. But for the survivors, there was still much work to be done. They needed to make sure that his legacy of abuse would not be erased by powerful people who still sought to protect him. While the world focused on Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, his longtime confidant and accomplice, continued to operate from the shadows. Maxwell had always been a mysterious figure, her influence often overlooked in favor of Epstein's larger-than-life persona. But as the investigation moved forward, it became clear that Maxwell had played a central role in his criminal empire. Maxwell's relationship with Epstein, both personal and professional, had been a key factor in his ability to evade justice. She was the one who groomed young girls, the one who made them feel comfortable, and the one who introduced them to Epstein. Some survivors have described her as being equally as manipulative and abusive as Epstein himself. Maxwell's arrest in 2020 would mark the beginning of another chapter in the fight for justice. But as she sat in a federal cell awaiting trial, the questions remained. How much did she know? How much did she enable? And how many more people had been involved in Epstein's web of abuse? As the investigation into Epstein's criminal network unfolds, one question haunts the survivors: how many more were involved? As the faces of the rich and powerful are slowly revealed, the magnitude of the situation becomes clear. The fight for justice is only beginning. Will the truth finally come to light? And more importantly, who else will be exposed as part of Epstein's dark world? The system failed these victims, but they won't let it continue to hide the truth. What happens next? Who will be brought to justice? And who will escape yet again? They told us to leave it alone. Epstein belongs to intelligence. Alexander Acosta, former U.S. Secretary of Labor, 2019. The words, quiet at first, echo like the faintest tremor in the silence. It's not just a story of a man who built an empire of cruelty. It's a reflection of a system that repeatedly turned a blind eye, one that empowered those who believed they were beyond reach. Epstein's story is, ultimately, not only about the abuse of women and girls, but about the abuse of power and the price of silence paid by those too afraid to speak, or perhaps too protected to be held accountable. The year was 2005, and in the sun-soaked streets of Palm Beach, Florida, a call was made that would ignite a firestorm. A call that would expose the man known to the world as Jeffrey Epstein. A mother, desperate and heartbroken, had discovered that her 14-year-old daughter had been lured into Epstein's Palm Beach mansion. The girl had been paid $300 to strip and massage Epstein. She was promised a future of easy money, but instead, she found herself caught in a dark world she could not escape. But for every victim that came forward, there were others. Thousands more whose stories remained buried, locked away by fear, by shame, by the very system that should have protected them. The mother's bravery in calling the police was one of the rare moments when the floodgates threatened to open. But the system, as it often does, closed ranks. It moved too slowly, too cautiously, too carelessly. And Epstein, with his wealth, his connections, and his chilling arrogance, moved even faster. He knew how to leverage influence, how to manipulate the right people. In courtrooms, in backrooms, and on private jets, the silence grew louder. The year 2008 would see Epstein's first brush with real consequences. Yet what should have been a moment of reckoning was anything but. A sweet deal, a deal of the century, as some would later call it, was brokered, not in the name of justice, but in the name of power. Alexander Acosta, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida, negotiated a plea deal that would grant Epstein a slap on the wrist for the countless crimes he had committed. The deal was so lenient, so shockingly favorable, that it was incomprehensible to anyone who wasn't entrenched in the world of power and privilege Epstein inhabited. Instead of facing the full brunt of federal charges, Epstein pleaded guilty to 2 state prostitution charges. He was sentenced to just 18 months in prison, a sentence he would only serve 13 months of, and with extensive work release privileges. For most prisoners, work release is a distant dream. For Epstein, it was a lifeline. The opportunity to walk free during the day, to return to his sprawling mansion at night, to live as if the world were still under his control. The victims, their names forgotten, their pain unaddressed, were left in the shadows. Acosta would later claim that he was told Epstein belonged to intelligence, a chilling statement that would haunt the entire narrative. Epstein, at that time, was untouchable, and those with the power to bring him down had simply decided it was not worth the effort, not worth disrupting the established order. But if Epstein was the face of the abuse, Ghislaine Maxwell was its quiet architect. She wasn't just his partner. She was the one who brought the victims to him. She was the one who groomed them, who prepared them to meet the man who would change their lives, and not in any good way. She had once been the darling of New York society, the charming daughter of a media magnate, Robert Maxwell. But in Epstein's world, she was more than just his lover. She was his enabler. Maxwell, with her polished manners and network of connections, played a key role in Epstein's operation. She was the one who recruited the young girls, the ones whose names we now know, but whose faces we never saw. One survivor, Virginia Jeffrey, would later testify that she was introduced to Epstein at the age of 17 by Maxwell herself. But the true scale of her involvement remained hidden for years, obscured by her ability to blend into the elite circles Epstein frequented. Maxwell's role, however, was not just that of an enabler. She was a woman in her own right, powerful and manipulative, controlling much of Epstein's day-to-day operations. For every woman that Epstein took advantage of, Maxwell was there, orchestrating the scene, ensuring that each step was taken in order to feed the machine they built. A machine built on human suffering. But silence, like all things, breaks. It doesn't last forever. The Miami Herald's investigation into Epstein would be the catalyst that would finally rip the curtain away. In November 2018, journalist Julie Brown published a bombshell expose that would lay bare the extent of Epstein's crimes. She painstakingly pieced together the stories of more than 80 survivors, women and girls who had been used, manipulated, and discarded by Epstein, some of whom were still children when it all began. Brown's investigation unearthed the stories that had been buried under years of silence. It wasn't just the women who had been abused. It was the system that had protected Epstein. The politicians, the businessmen, the law enforcement officials who turned a blind eye to the allegations. Brown's reporting forced a reckoning that Epstein could no longer outrun. The emotional toll of this chapter was not just on the survivors, but on society itself. The realization that a man could wield such power so casually, so ruthlessly, without fear of reprisal, shook the public to its core. The survivors' grief was palpable, but it was tinged with something even darker. A fury that had been buried for far too long. July 6, 2019, marked a critical turning point in the saga of Epstein. The FBI, armed with new evidence and a growing sense of urgency, arrested him at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. For the first time, it seemed like the walls were finally closing in. He was charged with sex trafficking minors in Florida and New York, the charges that would finally put him in front of a federal court. But the arrest was not without complications. Epstein's behavior had been erratic, both in the days leading up to his arrest and in the moments afterward. He was a man who had lived his life at the top, who had always thought he was above the law. But now, he was just another man, trapped in the system he had once controlled so easily. The arrest would bring new revelations, new victims, and new questions. Would Epstein finally face justice? Or would his web of connections allow him to evade accountability once more? The public was left with one question that would loom over the investigation. How deep did Epstein's influence run? And how many powerful people were complicit in his crimes? Epstein's arrest was the beginning of the end, but it was far from the closure the victims had been waiting for. As he was led into custody, questions hung in the air. Was this truly the beginning of justice? Or was Epstein yet another man who would slip through the cracks? And what of those who had enabled him, those who had remained silent when they could have spoken, when they could have stopped him? Would they ever be held accountable? Or had the silence, the complicity, become so entrenched that even the truth itself could be buried forever? I had nowhere to turn. The system was supposed to protect me, but it was broken from the start. Virginia Giuffre, survivor. The words cut through the air like a sharpened blade, striking deep. It's a chilling reality. The system meant to protect the vulnerable, to deliver justice to the broken, failed them instead. For years, Epstein was a figure untouchable, a man whose web of power seemed to shield him from the law. But silence, like all things, cannot last forever. Even the most carefully constructed empire of lies will eventually collapse under the weight of truth. It all began with one phone call, one decision to keep pushing, to keep asking the hard questions. In 2018, investigative journalist Julie Brown of the Miami Herald took on the impossible task of piecing together a story that had been buried for over a decade. The quiet whispers of abuse that had once been dismissed, ignored, and silenced were now being shouted from the rooftops. Her investigation uncovered a trail of survivors, women and girls, whose stories had been brushed aside by law enforcement, whose voices had been drowned out by the powerful men who protected Epstein. It wasn't just about the horrific abuse. It was about the systemic failure that allowed Epstein to escape justice for so long. Brown's work was a landmark moment, a reminder that silence, when broken, becomes an unstoppable force. But it wasn't just about the headlines. The emotional gravity of her investigation was revealed not just in the facts she uncovered, but in the lives she touched. Women who had been victimized, who had endured years of trauma in silence, were now given the platform they deserved. And with every new revelation, with every name, every victim, the walls that had protected Epstein began to crack. In the press conference announcing her findings, Brown stood in front of the survivors who had trusted her, their faces a mix of defiance, grief, and disbelief. The years of darkness, the years of being told to stay quiet, were now over. For them, it was not just a legal victory, it was an emotional one. As Brown's investigation gained traction, the world began to pay attention, and the momentum to bring Epstein to justice intensified. But the road to accountability was never simple. In 2019, Epstein was finally arrested, facing federal charges of sex trafficking minors in both Florida and New York. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. But as the case unfolded, the courtroom was filled with more questions than answers. Epstein's defense team was swift, and they were ready. As they argued in court, they painted Epstein as a man who had simply made mistakes, a wealthy financier who had become caught up in the allure of power, a man who, though he had done wrong, deserved to be treated with leniency. This, however, was not just a courtroom battle. It was a battle for justice. The survivors, the women whose voices had been silenced for so long, watched as Epstein's team attempted to distort the truth, to make the case about his rights rather than the rights of those he had abused. In the court, the body language of both sides was telling. Epstein's defense was cold, calculated, almost detached. Their arguments seemed to revolve not around the enormity of his actions, but around protecting his reputation, his wealth, his influence. The prosecution, however, stood unwavering, determined to reveal the full extent of Epstein's crimes and the countless lives he had shattered. Every word in that courtroom carried weight. But it was not just the lawyers speaking. The survivors, too, were speaking, in their testimonies, in the way they held their ground in the face of Epstein's team. Their eyes, filled with pain and determination, told a story that no legal argument could dismiss. And when Virginia Giuffre, one of Epstein's most prominent accusers, took the stand, her words were a powerful turning point. When Virginia Giuffre stood up to testify, it wasn't just her voice that was heard. It was the voice of every survivor who had been silenced, the voice of every young girl who had been exploited. For years, her story had been dismissed, but now she had the chance to speak out. Her testimony was raw, emotional, and heart-wrenching. She recounted the horrors she had endured at the hands of Epstein, the manipulation, the grooming, the trauma that would haunt her for the rest of her life. In the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Her every word seemed to resonate with the audience, a reminder of just how many lives Epstein had destroyed. As Giuffre spoke, there was no hiding from the truth. The public had no choice but to confront the reality of Epstein's web of abuse. Giuffre's testimony was a pivotal moment, but it was also a moment of profound emotional depth. The anger, the hurt, the shame, they were all there, intertwined in every sentence. The fight for justice was not just legal, it was personal, a battle for dignity and for the lives of those who had been violated. As the case progressed, more and more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. One of the most significant pieces came in the form of the flight logs, detailed records of the private jets that Epstein used to shuttle high-profile individuals to his private island, Little St. James. The flight logs, once sealed, were now public. They revealed names that no one expected: former presidents, world leaders, businessmen, celebrities. The names on those logs painted a picture of a man who wasn't just a financier. He was a puppet master, pulling the strings of power at the highest levels of society. The implications of the flight logs were staggering. They raised a new question. How far did Epstein's influence really extend? How many of these individuals were complicit in his crimes, whether knowingly or unknowingly? The logs didn't just implicate Epstein, they implicated the system itself, one that had allowed a man with such connections to remain untouchable for so long. The release of these documents created an even greater sense of urgency. The more the world learned, the more questions arose. What were these powerful figures doing on Epstein's plane? What did they know? And most importantly, why hadn't anyone done anything sooner? As the legal proceedings against Epstein continued, another, more insidious question began to emerge. Who else knew? The silence of so many in Epstein's orbit was deafening. Friends, colleagues, acquaintances, all of them had seen something, had heard something, but few had said anything. The powerful men who had surrounded Epstein, the women who had worked for him, the law enforcement officers who had brushed aside the allegations. They all played a part in allowing Epstein to continue his abuse. One of the most disturbing revelations was that many had been complicit in a system that allowed Epstein to operate without fear of consequences. People who had access to the highest echelons of power and influence had been willing to turn a blind eye, to stay silent, to protect their own interests at the expense of justice. The world was now left grappling with the unsettling truth that these individuals had chosen to stay quiet, that they had been willing to sacrifice the lives of young girls in exchange for their own power and comfort. But as the trial unfolded, there was still much that remained hidden. The survivors, the witnesses, the investigators, they had all done their part. But there were still powerful figures in the shadows, still untold stories, still unanswered questions. Would Epstein's co-conspirators be brought to justice? Or would the system continue to protect those who had helped him build his empire of terror? The reckoning had only just begun, and with it, the hope that justice would finally be served. But the real question remained: would the truth ever truly be revealed? And at what cost?